Well, good morning, everybody. As we walk through some of the highlights of this near-term forecast, I want to begin with a radar animation here over the last 10 hours or so. We had over 50 reports of severe weather that stretched from eastern Texas all the way into parts of southern Georgia and Florida. And this morning, 3 new tornado reports came out right here in parts of Alabama, Georgia, and parts of Florida. So some pretty rough storms coming through this area today. We're going to watch that severe weather risk move through Florida, Georgia, North and South Carolina later today. And we could hear thunder as far north as Virginia by the time we get into this afternoon and this evening. Now, the heavy rains out ahead of this did press into parts of the Ohio Valley through the Mid-South, and this is what's going to make picking up some snow later today more challenging because the snow that was on the back side of this, which produced heavy snowfall amounts from parts of Texas, Oklahoma, into Kansas, Nebraska, and getting up into Iowa last night, slowly starting to fade from west to east, but it still has some very strong winds on the back side. Well, that rain out ahead of this is what's going to make the snow that will fall difficult to kind of measure in its depth because some of it's going to melt because it's quite mild with this system. This will be our most northerly track of the next 3 systems, and each one will progressively get farther to the south, which will change where and when the snow is going to fall. But system number 2 is currently pushing into the northwest, where there's some pretty strong winds early this morning. So looking at the last 72 hours of total accumulated precipitation, I just wanted to point out one thing. With the severe weather we saw down here across the south, we also had some very heavy rainfall coming out of Louisiana into Mississippi and Alabama. And some of this area did see also some large hail, but this is one of our parts of the country that is kind of deepest in drought relative to their location. So to see this heavy rainfall, well, it's a lot in a short amount of time, meaning there will be runoff. This will be corrective on the longer standing drought issues we've had here. Now, again, most of this on the backside has been very heavy snowfall, and we'll take a look once this system is said and done as to how much it was. But some places here picking up well over a foot of snow, and more is expected to come as we watch this system roll farther into the Great Lakes later today. We still have the winter storm warnings out for a broad area this morning, stretching from Kansas all the way to Michigan. This is all high wind advisory. The flood watches extend from northern Georgia all the way into New England. Some of this is going to be because of the melt of the snow that was there. But our tornado watch area is still identified down here with the strong storms pressing into the southeast, and look what follows it. We have blizzard warnings out, we have winter storm warnings out, we have winter weather advisories, and there's a lot of cold air on the southern side of this, prompting these freeze warnings from California's Central Valley, kind of the San Joaquin Valley here, all the way down, the southern half of Arizona. So with all of that, let's kind of dig into where this is going. We can see the enhanced risk from Florida all the way up to South Carolina and North Carolina today. So we're going to watch that frontal boundary swipe through there, and that's what's going to bring the risk of those strong straight line winds, the risk of some isolated hail and tornadoes out ahead of this. Watch for this line to start to break up, becoming what we call a QLCS, a quasi-linear convective system. What that means is embedded tornadic circulations within that line. So very risky day today, stretching from the Carolinas down into Florida. On the backside, the snow begins to taper, but it will do so with very strong winds. It will spread into Missouri, Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, maybe even clipping parts of Kentucky as the system rolls farther into the north and east. But such a pull on very mild air coming off of the ocean here is keeping all of this over as rain, and that's what's going to create the flooding problems for parts of New England. Now, meanwhile, the system coming in behind it's got a big punch for the northwest, including some locally very heavy snowfall amounts for the Cascades and Northern Rockies. And there's a frontal boundary that sneaks in ahead of system number 2. That would be this front here that's going to stretch from parts of the southern Canadian prairie into the northern plains by the time we get into Wednesday. Now, system number 2 is right here, and it's going to start to gather by Thursday night over the panhandles and then take off into the eastern half of the country. But as it stands, you combine all 3 of these systems together, they all have quite a bit of wind with them, very strong winds. Most of the country will see wind gusts at some point between now and the next 8 days in the 30 to 50 mile an hour range. The upper level support is quite amazing. There's system number 1, here's system number 2, and there's system number 3 coming in. And as each of these comes in, the low pressure trajectory is going to move farther and farther to the south. So the one today starts off here this morning and goes into Ontario and Quebec. Second system develops in the panhandles Thursday, Friday, and it takes a little bit farther to the south trajectory like this. And the third system will be coming in after the Arctic air arrives, and it will likely start off here and go way far to the south on the nose of high pressure. All said and done, we're expecting most of the country to see above average precipitation in the next 10 days. And when I look at this, I see the west adding up snow. I see the drought in the central part of the United States seeing some corrective action and more flooding from the southeast up the east coast. But this is going to be one of the issues we have to watch unfold over the next several weeks to months to get into the 2024 growing season without major risk of a lack of subsurface soil moisture. So that's what I'll be watching carefully. I want to quickly run through the models with you. And again, you can see these at agweather.com, ag-wx.com. So playing through Wednesday, getting into Thursday, here's system number 2. And as it comes out, it's got a much farther to the south trajectory. It, just like the previous system, will bring in the risk of severe weather across the south. But you can now see as I float back and forth between Friday and Saturday, where that snow is possibly going to be a little bit farther to the south out of this system. Pulls into Ontario, Quebec, brings snow into New England, and then behind it is system number 3. Now this one's born on the nose of cold air at high pressure, so you can see it's bringing down the risk of snow farther to the south and also the risk of some ice. But if we add all this up, your next 7 days of total accumulated precipitation from the European, here it is from the GFS. So again, European, GFS, and this is what the snow is expected to look like. Now please remember, we use these maps to identify where the snow will be, not the snow amount. It's using a 10-to-1 ratio, which will not apply for these next few systems. System number 3, though, is the one that's delivering the chance for some snow here and maybe up the East Coast next Wednesday, Thursday. But the heavy snows in the near term are here and throughout the West. That's the European model. Here's the GFS solution. Again, European, GFS. And then I just want to mention the risk next Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday for ice in this corridor. So keep a close eye out on that with me here. Some probability maps. Chance of getting 6 inches, chance of getting 12 inches, chance of getting 18. Now again, we're using the 10-to-1 ratio on these maps. So again, 6 to 12 to 18 inches. And if we look here on the drier side of this, parts of the Canadian Prairie, Northern Plains, Western Plains, and Southwest are going to be missing out, while the flood threat remains quite high for much of the eastern part of the United States, with the probability of over 2 inches of liquid out of this system being very high in this region. The only other place that can match it would be the Pacific Northwest right here along the coast. By the time we get into week 2, the jet stream goes back into a very El Nino-like configuration, extending across Asia, getting out into the open Pacific, and then running pretty far to the south. That's going to result in a bit of a split across the west, giving us northwest flow. And the end result of that is wetter in California, possibly wetter along the Gulf Coast, but with flow coming back in out of the northwest, this will be a bit drier. Now, how long does that last? Do we kick up more troughs to kind of sweep this out? There are some indications that that could occur, but first, let's talk about the temperatures. Watch Montana. Today in the 40s, by Thursday into Friday, struggling to get highs above -10. Very cold air that's coming in here. We see that cold air continuing to spread farther to the south into early next week, and this will be where the next low will ride out, the third one, will ride out on the southern edge of this colder air. In terms of kind of 5-day chunks, by the time we get into day 5 through 10, this cold air makes it all the way to the Gulf Coast. This is averaging a 5-day stretch of weather here with temperatures more than 20 degrees colder than normal. But mild air begins to flood back into the Pacific, out of the Pacific, into the west by the time we get to day 10 through 15. Now, I mentioned how long do we keep that storm track around, the one we're going to get into mid to late month. It's all going to depend on the interplay between the MJO and El Nino. And I just want to remind you, if you go watch the longer video, we talk about the differences between the models and their trajectory on how quickly this El Nino is expected to fade. And that's what gives you greater risk of drought versus greater risk of wet when you compare the ECMWF to the National Multi-Model Ensemble. I go into this in detail in that longer video. So just go find it in the video and watch that section. We're going to finish with South America. We still have more rain coming for the center-west region. This is the chance of getting 2 inches over the next 10 days. There's also some pretty heavy rains coming into Argentina, which is really breaking its long-standing drought with some local flooding around Cordoba. But my biggest concern will be late in January and early February. Do we keep wet conditions around for northern Brazil during the heart of harvest? That could be problematic. That could slow down the harvesting, slow down the planting of safrinha crop. And my worry about the safrinha crop comes down to one thing. If El Nino is still around by April, that will produce a drier risk in this area, a quicker shutdown of the monsoon. In other words, a slowing of the monsoon early. So we'll watch that. We'll keep talking about it. I appreciate your attention this morning. We'll talk again tomorrow. Thanks.